Good afternoon and welcome to Webinar Wednesday. Today we are joined by Lewis Lennard, Product Manager North America at Rigel Medical. Webinar Wednesday, we would like to thank our sponsor, Rigel Medical. Rigel Medical is renowned globally as a designer and manufacturer of reliable, portable and compact biomedical test equipment. As metrology specialists for almost 4 decades, their innovative testing solutions have been mitigating risk worldwide in healthcare environments. Their products ensure that critical medical equipment is safe to use throughout the device's life cycle. So for more information, please visit rigelmedical.com. Now, just a quick reminder to please join us for our HTM Mixer, which is being held at the Hyatt Regency in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, July 31st and August the 1st. Mixers are a slightly modified, smaller and shorter duration and less crowded event that still provides valuable continuing education, networking and vendor engagement opportunities. So for more information and registration details, please visit htmmixer.com. Please also remember to save the date for our Fall MD Expo, which will be held at the Renaissance Dallas Addison Hotel in Dallas, Texas, from November the 10th to the 12th. So please join us for 3 days of education, networking, and the latest advances in medical technology products and services. For more information and details, please visit mdexposhow.com. Okay, today's webinar, as usual, is eligible for 1 CE credit from the ACI, and you can obtain your CE certificate by completing the post-webinar survey, which will be emailed 1 hour after the completion of today's webinar. You must complete the survey to receive your 1 CE credit, and you'll be able to download the certificate directly from your computer once the survey is submitted. If you have any questions, you can reach us at webinar@mdpublishing.com. Now, let's kick off today's webinar by giving away a Swiss Force Meister multi-tool. So using the questions feature on your dashboard, let me know the answer to the following trivia question. June is Alzheimer's and Brain Awareness Month. What colour is associated with the Alzheimer's Association? I'll reveal the answer and our winner at the end of the webinar. We'll be wrapping up today's presentation with a live Q&A, so please submit your questions anytime using the questions feature on your dashboard. As I mentioned earlier, our presenter today is Lewis Lennard. So Lewis, you may begin whenever you're ready.
Okay, well, thanks Linda. Well, welcome everyone and thank you for joining today's webinar on AED testing. I'm going to be talking about automated external defibrillators and how they're life-saving devices and making sure that they're ready to perform when they're needed. AEDs are obviously available in multiple settings, but we need to make sure that they're always ready to work when they're needed, and not just relying on the self-tests that are provided from some of the OEMs. Of course, many of the manufacturers do specify no tests beyond those self-tests, but it's talking about how we can introduce and improve the performance testing that's required out in the real world with real performance testing to make sure that the device is ready when it counts. I'm going to talk a little bit about the best practices, the tools that we can use, and some of the strategies that ensure that the AEDs should be working when they should. And also talk a little bit about legislation around the world and how it is changing now in terms of where AEDs are implemented and how much service and testing is required. I mean, I won't go through this slide. Linda already elaborated on a little bit about what we do at Rigel. It's effectively just goes into that a little bit more. So I'm going to skip this slide and just get straight into the webinar itself. And I'm going to start with the basics, and it's these basics that save lives. Cardiac arrest is when the heart suddenly stops beating effectively. This is not slowing down; it's when it stops completely. And that means there's no blood being pumped around the body, there's no circulation, and that means that there's no oxygen reaching your brain, your vital organs. And when that happens, you've only got a matter of minutes before the damage can set in, ultimately leading to death if there's no treatment that occurs. Now, around 70% of all cardiac arrests happen at home. This could be in the living room, in the kitchen, and that means that the majority of the first responder in many cases is yourself or a family member or a neighbor. It's always going to be someone very close to you. And that shows how important it is that we have AEDs in multiple settings. And just to show you how widespread this is, there are between 10 and 60,000 out-of-hospital cardiac arrests in France. The UK is around 30,000. And in the US, that number climbs up to 350K. So that's almost 1,000 people a day in the US alone. And the reason I bring up some of the other countries here is because of the legislation that's been introduced because of that. And one of the worst parts about this is that people who collapse outside of a hospital, they've only got about a 1 in 10 chance of survival. So the 10% chance after a out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. If you're in a hospital, then that number doubles to 1 in 5, because obviously if you're in a hospital, that means you've got trained staff, there's equipment, and ultimately it comes down to speed. People know how to react to a cardiac arrest in a hospital, obviously, because they're fully trained on how to intervene when that happens. And that's why AEDs are so important, because if the knowledge outside of the hospital can be improved, the time that it takes to perform those shocks will have a much bigger effect on the levels of survival. So the cardiac arrest is a race against time. So every second counts when it comes to saving a life. Now an AED just looks like a very simple box that hangs on the wall somewhere, but it's one of the most important medical devices you'll ever find out in public. And using an AED in public can increase survival rates by 2 to 3 times. And that's just from someone having the courage to open that box, follow the prompts from the AED, and then applying the pads. And that's the difference between life and death. You can't go wrong with an AED. It's something that anyone can use. Ultimately, it's just up to the person to be brave enough to use it. Now, if a shock is delivered within 3 to 5 minutes of collapse, the survival rate can jump up to 74%. So that's nearly 3 in 4 people that survive in that would otherwise be a fatal event. And you don't need to be a trained clinician to use an AED. It really is designed to be used by anyone. And then what happens is they walk you through with these voice prompts and give you step-by-step guidance on how it works. And the reason for that is that they're also very smart devices. What they do is they have built-in measurement devices that detect whether a person's heart is in a shockable rhythm, and that means that they do this as it's an analyzer, and it does deliver a shock to the patient, so you physically cannot mess up. Now at Rigel, when we test those pieces of equipment, what we're actually doing is simulating the ECG arrhythmias and then testing the shock to ensure that the AEDs are still performing as they should. They're still analysing the heart arrhythmias, but also ensuring that the energy levels are appropriate. We've got them in many places as well. They're in public spaces all over the place. They're in airports. You'll see them in shopping malls, schools, and just general public healthcare settings. So if ever you're worried about using an AED, you don't need to be. The device is going to guide you through it, and the science is clear. AEDs saves lives, and it's always important that they must be used. And I wanted to talk about this because this is what we're talking about for the main presentation is, well, what about AEDs that don't work? All right, we've got AEDs that sit in multiple locations. Are they all being serviced? Not in all cases. Sometimes they're being left for many years without a regular service and checks, and that means that there are issues out there with AEDs performing when they should. So we know that AEDs can save lives because within the first few minutes, that means that the survival is greatly increased. But what really makes a bigger difference is, one, that AEDs are working, and also that people are trained and confident enough to use them. We also need to make sure that there are enough people out there that also are trained in CPR, because there are arrhythmias that are non-shockable, and that's where training comes in, and that can also increase survival rates out in public. Okay, so we'll talk about AED maintenance as it's a growing concern. Let's just say that a person's done everything they can. They've approached someone that's collapsed. They've got a cardiac arrest. They go looking for an AED, and they can't find it. Or, maybe even worse is if it doesn't even work. They find an AED. They bring it back to the patient, and then they find out that the AED is not actually working. And the reason I spoke about France earlier is there was a study done just last year that found 30 to 40% of AEDs in public locations in France were found to be out of service during routine inspection. So that's over 1 in 3 devices that could fail in the moment that they're really needed. You also see this in the UK. This is something that I've come across back home. They use AEDs in some of the old phone boxes now that are no longer used as payphones. They've been turned into AED stations. I quite like the idea of it because it's quite creative and it's giving life to something that we don't use anymore, thanks to the use of cell phones. But the AEDs inside those phone boxes, they're not always being maintained. They're in rural locations. They might be in small villages, small towns. And in fact, before I came out here in my small town, there was one that looked completely dead. I didn't verify to see if it was working, but it looked like it'd been there for a while. And that's a major oversight. We can't spend all this money installing AEDs in these rural locations, but if they're not being maintained, then what's the point really? It's they're not being looked at, and we just forget to check them. Now that's changed, and that's because of what's been found in France. They've got legal repercussions now if AEDs are not being tested. That doesn't mean just the presence of the AED in the setting. It means that they have to be working as well, and these are legal requirements in specific locations as well. It's train stations, schools, malls, and a couple of other locations, but they must be present in multiple locations. Okay, so a little bit more about those legal obligations that have been introduced in France, and really we want to try and apply that in the US as well. It's started to become more of a legislation in certain states, but if we can make that countrywide, then we're going to improve patient outcomes. So let's say someone has a heart attack and the AED doesn't work. What's the outcome? I mean, the patient doesn't survive, they pass away. So in some places, that's just a tragedy. It's the nature of what happens. Maybe equipment doesn't work, but really, is that the case? It's still a legal violation. There can be some obligations there, and that's exactly what we're starting to see in some countries, where employers, people that are looking after those facilities, they are legally required to take care of those AEDs. And not only are they mandatory in those places, they need to make sure that they are serviced well and to the OEM requirements. And that just proves that AEDs, they're not optional devices, they're life-saving medical equipment, and they're ultimately responsible for public safety. And really, if you look at this, the non-compliance is quite serious now. It's 5 years in prison and a fine of 75,000 euros. That's close to $100,000. So it's not exactly a slap on the wrist. It's a huge penalty for failing to look after a device that's there to save someone else's life. So it's not about just being ready. It's also taking accountability in those facilities. They're a part of standard care, not just in hospitals now, but also out in the public. The consequences are quite serious. So I'll talk a little bit more about the CPR and what's required and how much time it takes before someone passes away if they don't get treatment within a specified period. After 9 minutes, you've got a 10% chance of survival. By the time it gets to 10 minutes, you've got a 5% chance of survival. So it's a really short period of time when you go into ventricular fibrillation. However, if you can deliver a shock within 1 minute, they've got a 90% chance of survival. And effectively, you're dropping off by 10% every minute. It's almost linear, the amount of time that it takes before someone passes away from this. And that kind of goes over the overview of AEDs, but I'm kind of going to pull a step back further and talk about the heart and the cardiac cycle, and that kind of helps us understand the application of defibrillation and pacemaking, but also why testing is important. So the heart itself, to understand how defibrillators work, we need to understand how the heart works when it's healthy. This is a basic level, I guess, biology, but it's always good to have a recap. It took me having a look at this before I delivered this presentation. I've forgotten a lot about it, so it's good to always have a bit of a recap on how the heart works. And it's good to think about the heart as a 4-room pump. There's like 2 rooms at the top and then 2 at the bottom. The right and left atria sit at the top, and then the right and left ventricles are down below here. And these chambers are made up of a special muscle called the myocardium, and it never stops beating. At least it's designed to work for the rest of your life. If it ever stops, then that means you're in a critical condition, and it's beating around about 100,000 times a day. And it runs on electricity. I mean, you've got an electrical circuit here that is driving the muscle. So it's got its own natural pacemaker. And that's what creates the cardiac arrhythmias, and it's controlling the timing of the heart pumping blood around the body. So it begins with the atria contracting, and that fills up the ventricles with blood. And then the ventricles just pump blood out to the body, to the lungs, to refill, to accumulate oxygen. That comes back to the heart, and that goes around the body. That's what we call the cardiac cycle. So the heart's doing its job. It's pumping blood to the lungs, the oxygenated blood, and it's coming back to the heart to be pumped around the body. After the ventricles contract and they pump blood around the body, the heart goes into this phase called diastole, and that's where the chambers start to refill, getting ready for that next squeeze to pump around the body. So at the right side here, pumping deoxygenated blood, that's any blood that's used up. That's going to come back to the right atrium, top chamber, and that's going to pass that around the body. So the blood makes a pit stop up here in the lungs. It gathers oxygen, it comes back to the heart, and then it just pumps blood around the body. And it goes to when it gets to the organs, the body replaces that with carbon dioxide, uses the oxygen for fuel, and that then makes its way back to the heart. So it's the oxygen-rich blood that is going through the arteries, to the brain, to the kidneys, for literally everywhere for the body to survive. And it's relying on that to keep the body functioning correctly. It's such an important process that if there's an interruption to any rhythms or arrhythmias, that's why every minute counts when it comes to defibrillation. We need to make sure that when the heart is in a specific arrhythmia that's threatening to life, then we need to bring that natural arrhythmia back to the heart. This is where I'll talk about fibrillation and defibrillation, and also how defibrillators can vary by function and application. With the timed electrical signal that keeps the heart going, what happens if that electrical signal starts to behave erratically? That's what an arrhythmia is. It's when those electrical signals start to break down. And that's what we call fibrillation. It's when the heart goes into electrical chaos. And there's multiple types of arrhythmias. And if we talk about atrial fibrillation first, that's when the the top chambers of the heart start to quiver, and that can affect the amount of blood that's going to the ventricles. So they're not necessarily pumping effectively, they're shaking, and that means that blood isn't as effectively getting to the ventricles. What that means is that it's not immediately life-threatening either. Blood is still getting to the ventricles to be pumped around the body. It's not a good condition to be in, however, it can lead to complications over time, but it's not as serious as ventricular fibrillation, or VF. And this is where things can get pretty serious. And these are those big, strong chambers at the bottom that pump blood to the lungs and the rest of the body. So when those muscles start to quiver and you've got electrical chaos, then the ventricles can't contract and the heart stops pumping blood completely around the body. And that means no circulation and no oxygen getting to the organs. And that's when people can collapse, and ultimately it can lead to death. Ventricular fibrillation starts as VF course. You may have seen this on some of the patient monitors or simulators. And then over time, it slowly reduces to VF fine. And then eventually, if you don't get treatment, then it leads to flatline, asystole. And that means there's no electrical activity at all. The problem with that is then at that point, you've got no chance to shock. If you don't have any electrical activity, then there's nothing to reset. And that's where CPR comes in. And this whole thing can happen within a matter of 9 minutes before you can get to that asystole stage. So VF is the most serious condition. It's the #1 cause of heart attacks, cardiac arrest, and the only way to correct that is by using a defibrillator, such as an AED. So we've got an idea of what fibrillation is and how we treat it, but when does defibrillation work and when does it not work? If we talk about AF, and it's actually pretty common. When you reach the age of 40, I think it's something like 25 to 30% of people will have some type of AF during their lifetime. So AF is a pretty common condition, but it's manageable, and it's done by being treated with medication. Sometimes with ablation, if it's a more serious form of AF, that just sort of correct. Basically, what ablation does is it corrects the electrical conductivity of the circuit. So if you're talking about it from an electrical perspective, that ablation is cauterizing certain parts of the heart to allow the electrical signals to flow correctly. But with ventricular fibrillation, that's a lot more serious. And the most effective treatment for that is defibrillation. It's an electrical reset to stop the chaos that's going on and give the heart a chance to restart, use its natural pacemaker to get back to normal. That being said, there's not all ventricular fibrillations are shockable. Some forms are non-shockable, and we talk about that in some of the next few slides. There's a couple of arrhythmias that are shockable but require synchronization, and then just non-shockable, or you have to use CPR or meds like adrenaline to try and generate some type of electrical activity. Once you get that electrical activity back, once you get back to VF, then you can use defibrillation to get the arrhythmia back to normal. Basically, that means that not all types of fibrillation are fatal. AF is not necessarily fatal, but it also means that not all, on the other side, that not all rhythms are shockable as well. And it's knowing that difference, which helps save lives. With AEDs, it's less of an issue when it comes to what types are shockable, but with the more advanced life support defibrillators, it is important to understand that. So how does it work? When you deliver a shock with a defibrillator, you just send in a high energy electrical pulse across the heart, and you need to make sure that the current flows right through the center of the chest here. through the heart muscle, and that's where the idea of pad placement comes in, the sternum and apex. Most defibrillators are going to still give you that prompt. So the AEDs have these voice prompts and clear diagrams, but the standard layout is typically from the upper right side of the chest to the left side, just a few inches below or around the ribs, and that's the apex. But again, AEDs should have that on there to walk you through it, and that goes right through the ventricles here, where VF is taking hold. That's why that placement is so important. We want to make sure that all the energy is flowing to the ventricles where ventricular fibrillation occurs. There are a couple of there's another way of applying pads. So there's anterior to anterior or anterior to posterior, and this example is anterior to anterior, but you can also have the pads on the front and the back. Normally that depends on the size of the patient. This is the most standard version, but not always practical. When it comes to the resistance of the human body, it can vary between patients. So sometimes anterior to posterior is what's required. Ultimately, that's up to the clinician to decide when it comes to that placement, because AEDs will typically only recommend anterior to anterior. Okay, so one of the most common myths, we've spoken about this before in other defib webinars, is that the defibrillator starts the heart and it's used when there's a flat line. And this was common in a lot of medical dramas back in the day, where the heart monitor would show up as a flat line. The doctor runs in, he shocks the patient, and the heart starts beating again. They think that that's correct. It's not the truth. The truth is that when a defibrillator doesn't restart a heart that's stopped, all it's doing is trying to stop that chaotic arrhythmia, so it can restart by itself to its natural rhythm. With ventricular fibrillation, the heart's got a erratic behavior. The heart's good, so it's not pumping any blood anymore. The defibrillation just is a shock that's going to stop all that chaotic activity, and then that's what allows the heart to just regain control and begin to pump normally. If it hits asystole and there's no electrical activity, then there's no electrical activity to reset as well. So that means there's nothing to shock, and that's where CPR medications come in that can hopefully produce some type of rhythm that the defib can work with. We talk about some other types of defibrillators. This presentation is mostly about AEDs, but there are also advanced life support defibrillators, and that's when a patient's in a hospital or in an ambulance. You'll see something that's a lot more advanced than what an AED can do. And these aren't just AEDs, they're full medical devices. They have multiple functions in a single device. In fact, if you're testing an advanced life support defibrillator, you're going to need a patient simulator as well, because they also offer ECG monitoring. They look at SpO2, blood pressure, and even CO2 in some cases. So they're very advanced medical devices. But on the other difference between these and AEDs is that they have a manual defib mode, and that means that the trained medical service teams that are relying on the arrhythmias, they can actually assess themselves whether they think defibrillation must be performed. So that can be overrode with the advanced life support defibrillators. They can choose when a shock is delivered. And you'll see also on these advanced life support defibrillators that there are AED modes as well. So it can be used in that manner as well. And that's one of the differences between some of these more advanced defibrillators. And then we've got the basic life support defibrillators. And these are generally just for public safety. You'll see them in hospitals as well, but they are in multiple locations. I've seen them in every setting. In fact, you'll if you ever follow one of the manufacturers called Zoll, they actually regularly post the locations that they're in, and they're in all types of areas that you wouldn't believe. The main facilities are airports, gyms, and schools, places where you're expected to see you may see problems with heart conditions. I was actually playing for a local team here in Florida, and a guy who was only 26, he had a heart attack and they had to use an AED. So I've seen it firsthand, and it's really important that they are in all these places. But they're in all types of facilities now. You'll see them in office buildings, in restaurants. They're all over the place. And the best thing about it, you don't need to have medical training. They're designed for public use, and they can be used by anyone. Any untrained person can come in and use them. It's about having that confidence to use them. As soon as you open the lid of an AED, it's going to start talking to you. It'll give you prompts, and it's these instructions that will help you to assess the patient, look at where to place the pads, and also talk about CPR if you know how to deliver it. And what it's doing is it's automatically analyzing those heart rhythms, and it's only going to deliver a shock if it detects a rhythm that it can treat, like ventricular fibrillation, and it's or VT as well, which is ventricular tachycardia. So there's two types of shocks that it can when it can deliver. And if it doesn't see either of these rhythms through the pads, then it won't let you shock at all. And those built-in safety features are why AEDs are so prevalent out in the field, and also becoming more of a requirement in those public spaces. They use quite complex algorithms as well. We work with some of the manufacturers, and they determine whether and when to deliver an electric shock. So they're looking at not just the arrhythms, but also repeatability of the electrical signal. Because if it sees there's some type of repeatability there, then clearly there's some type of rhythm that's not quite VF, even if it looks like a VF signal. So they're becoming more and more complex as time goes on in the way that they assess a patient's condition. And that kind of comes well on to the next slides, is that many arrhythms are shockable, but there's also a few arrhythmias when alternative treatment is required, and also where a synchronized shock can be provided. And I'll talk a little bit about what that is in some of these next slides. So we know what the AED is doing. It's recognizing the arrhythmias. It's designed to assess the patient, and then looking at whether it should shock or not. Most patients that go into cardiac arrest don't necessarily need a shock. It's AED's first line of defense is to just look at that rhythm and find out what it is. So shockable, one that defibrillation can correct. There's non-shockable, and that means that there's no activity, or at least low activity. And then there's also some rhythms that require a synchronized defib, and that's when there's still pulses present, and there's ways that they assess the timing of those signals so they don't shock at the sensitive periods. That means that if you shock at the wrong time during that sensitive period, it's called the repolarization phase. That can actually lead to fibrillation, so it has a negative effect. And some of the diagrams explain that a little bit better. So some that require synchronization unsynchronized fibrillation is VF, fine and coarse, and pulseless VT are some of those examples. VF fine is just a lower amplitude version of VF coarse, and VT we haven't got on here, but those are the two types of arrhythmias that can be shocked without having to synchronize them. But we also have the synchronized shocks, And there is ventricular fibrillation present, but there's also present VF pulses. So we have atrial flutter, that's a rapid, but there's a regular ventricular pulse, and that's where a synchronized shock. So if you see a waveform like this, then that's where a synchronized shock is required. And we've also got AFib, and that means that there's just a random firing in the atria. It's not a full emergency because you're still getting the occasional pumping of the blood around the body, but it's still a serious condition that needs to be reset. And what the AED is also doing during this synchronized shocking is it's looking for the pulses, so it doesn't shock during the vulnerable T wave. It allows a delay before a shock is performed. Okay, so what about the ones where non-shockable arrhythmias that you can't shock at all? That's where part of what makes innovation and CPR critical. There's two main shockable arrhythmias that cannot be shocked. There's pulseless electrical activity. Some people will ask me, what's the difference between PEA and asystole? Because it's effectively look the same to the patient, because but asystole is flatline from the electrical perspective. On the ECG, it might look like the heart's beating. There's some electrical activity there, but when you go to check for a pulse, there's nothing. So that means that the heart might be sending electrical signals, but the muscle in the heart isn't responding, so there's no actual contraction. And that means that defibrillation can't really help there, because the rhythm isn't actually chaotic. It's not like ventricular fibrillation where it can be reset. It's still working, but it's not functioning. So the pulse electrical activity is not actually doing anything. It's like, well, you can see a normal ECG, but you've still not got a pulse. So clearly a defib shock is not gonna help with that. Then we've got asystole, and that's just flatline. That just means there's no electrical activity at all. There's no pulse, there's no heart movement, and the ECG is just going to show a flat line, or maybe a little bit of electrical activity, but generally it's just going to be a complete flat line. And that's where you need to use things like drugs to stimulate the heart back into electrical activity. And when this occurs, if you're using an AED like this one, and it sees either of these arrhythmias, it should let you know that there's no shock advised. If it's not, then there's something wrong with the AED. But they are very reliable when it comes to assessing the types of arrhythmias when they're being measured. So again, it just highlights the importance of some of these self-tests and also performance testing. So there's something called cardiac synchronization, and this is all to do with timing. Not all shocks are delivered in the same way. Sometimes with a rhythm like ventricular tachycardia that has a pulse, you don't just want to shock in a random point in time. You need to time it within the heart's natural rhythm. And this is where synchronized cardioversion comes in. And what we're doing is we're just aligning the shock with the R wave. And that's this spike here, represented on the ECG. Now, what the AED wants to do is allow a delay time before it delivers that shock, so it's not shocking during this vulnerable period. And that delay time is typically between 10 and 30 milliseconds. And that's what will be specified by the AED or defib manufacturer. And that sync button is what's providing that safeguard. It's making sure that we're not shocking a fairly treatable arrhythmia, because this isn't a treatable arrhythmia, by introducing it to a life-threatening one. I mean, if you shock a patient during this vulnerable T wave, that's going to introduce ventricular fibrillation, and we're just making sure that we're not making more issues than when we came in with, right? So it's just making sure that the delay time is after, and analyzers will measure that time inaccuracy. These defib analyzer tools, they allow us to measure that delay time between when it sees the R wave, or with the analyzer it's actually simulating the R wave, and then making sure that the energy is delivered within that specification. So that brings us on to defibrillator testing and how we go out in the field and perform performance tests, not electrical safety tests, but performance tests on defibs and what's required. Ultimately, this comes down to the OEM on what they decide should be tested. We can introduce other tests as long as it doesn't affect the performance of the AED. Some AED manufacturers will say you just need to do a self-test, and that is sufficient. However, it's not really an external standard. An AED is relying on itself to be safe, which is fine. If the OEM specify that, it's not necessarily a huge issue, but not having an external standard to test is something that a lot of hospitals don't agree with, and they are still carrying out performance tests to make sure they're still working. And there are ways to circumvent some of those issues, like draining the battery during a test, and also using pads that can't be reused. So we've covered what the defibs do, how they work, when to use them, but how do we go out there and test them? Most of the time they just sit on a shelf on a wall somewhere until they're required, but they do need regular testing and maintenance just to make sure that they're performing when they're needed. It's serious high voltage equipment as well, so it goes up to 360 joules on some of the older defibs, 200 joules for most of the modern ones, and obviously that's more than enough energy to cause serious injury. They are designed to restart the heart, so you can imagine if you handle them improperly when you're testing, then it's quite a serious consideration. First, what we need to do is look at the device under test. Every defib manufacturer and model has its own procedure, settings. You need to make sure you understand what those considerations are first. Also, we need to ensure that tests are carried out by competent individuals. We're using test loads to verify the specification of the device. We just want to make sure that there's no one in contact with the electrodes, and we double check all those connections. What you find now in a lot of biomed departments is they're testing with just 2 4mm insulated leads going directly into the analyzer, as opposed to just using pads, because there's always a risk inherently involved with defibs, and it's a serious one. Although unlikely, it's still something we should try and reduce as much as possible. We don't want untrained people using the equipment, so we need to make sure that the person that's carrying out this is a fully trained individual, a biomed tech or clinical engineer, and they're looking at whether the device is safe to use. So what exactly are we going to be testing for? What are the key test measurements? One is the amount of energy. We want to make sure that the total amount of energy delivered during a shock is what it's specified to, and there are specifications for that. They go up to 360 joules for monophasic, and then biphasic 200 joules, although the monophasic defibs are typically being phased out in more modern models, and biphasic is more commonly used. Sometimes you have to test for varying patient body impedance. Typically, a manufacturer is only going to specify 50 ohms. That's the standard that's included in most, but the resistance across the body can vary depending on whether it's a larger adult or a small child. So OEMs will typically test across a variety of defibrillator loads just to make sure that there's correct energy output across those loads. But generally for in-service testing, it's accepted that if the energy delivered during one load is accurate, then it will be across multiple loads, and that's the way that the manufacturers recommend it, and we follow those procedures. We've got peak voltage, that's just the highest voltage during the shock. Peak current, that's how much current is flying, the highest current is flowing through. That gives us, the current actually gives us an insight into the strength of the electrical pulse, but it's not necessarily something that's specified in service and calibration. Then we've got the pulse duration. This tells us how long the energy is being delivered. And if you're using specific devices like for example, our performance analyzer here, the Unipulse, it actually has a single screenshot grab of the energy that's delivered. So you will also see the waveform, and it gives you the pulse duration on screen. So effectively, it's a single shot oscilloscope to some extent. It gives you the full breakdown of what the waveform looks like, but also the values, which is, if you scroll through the settings, you can see that. Now, you always use an analyzer per manufacturer's guidance. Every model manufacturer will have its own test limits or tolerances that are recommended. It will have different test points, so it varies between what model, what the test points are. So you always need to refer to the PM procedure of the manufacturer. So that's the ultimate guidance you have to follow. But it is on us to try and push the requirements for testing for AEDs, because many of them, as I said, they've just got self-tests that are specified. And a little bit more about AED testing. This is the device that's going to be used, during those real world scenarios, out in the field, in public. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that testing an AED isn't just giving you a light and saying, oh, well, it powers on, it lights up, there's a battery, it's fine, it's all good. These devices, they also have those measurement for algorithms that need to work with accuracy. You make sure that those rhythms that are being measured are accurate. So we're making sure that those are tested as well. So first, what we're doing is simulating different cardiac arrhythmias, just like the real thing. What a defib analyzer is doing is simulating all the different electrical signals that you'll see in the heart, and it's going to feed those ECG waveforms into the AED to see how it reacts to that. Is it going to correctly identify ventricular fibrillation as a shockable arrhythmia? Is it going to tell the user that it's detected asystole or pulseless electrical activity correctly? And is it going to tell that there's no shock advised? And there's no option to perform that shock even. That's what it should be doing. But can it also tell the difference between a fast but safer rhythm and ones that are less life-threatening? So it needs to do all of those things accurately, and what we're doing, we're testing that response. We also need to measure the shock energy as well. We need to make sure that it's delivering the correct energy levels. And then we're also, and this is something else that sometimes gets missed, is the tests for the AED's ability to analyze ECG signal quality. How well will it filter noise out? And it's part of the standard for defibs. What the defib needs to do is filter out any noise that it sees on mains frequency, so 50 or 60 hertz, depending on where you are, is imposed onto the ECG signal. And what the AED or defib needs to do is recognize that interference and filter out those 50 or 60 hertz signals, and only recognize the ECG arrhythmia. And if you ever use an analyzer and you're testing a defib and you introduce that noise interference, you'll actually see the noise come up at first on the screen, and eventually what it should do is filter that noise out. And that's just mimicking real life scenarios where you might find mains interference in the hospital or in any sort of public space. So the AED must be able to analyze that rhythm correctly even through the noise that may be occurring. And if it passes all those tests, then we know it's ready to go back in the field. And it's always important that we get that right out in the field, and it's our job to make sure that it does. But that's the end of the presentation. I'd like to, hand it over to some of the attendees and find out what some of you guys are doing. Are you testing exactly to the manufacturer's specifications, where they may specify just self-tests, or are you going one step further? Are you actually doing those performance tests? And how are you doing? Are you putting in test leads for the pads? What about the batteries as well? What are we doing to make sure that we're not unnecessarily draining the battery? I know there's possible usages where you can actually just use a dummy battery for creating you disconnect the battery and you actually just connect the dummy battery just for the testing. And that's one way of performing it without reducing the quality of the instrument, but we need to push that forward and see how we can improve testing out in the field, because sometimes the OEMs are not as involved in the real world scenarios, and it's always good to try and push that onto legislation on how we can get that introduced. I'll wait for some of your questions to come through. For those that were just attending, really appreciate your time. I hope it was useful, but that's the end of today's presentation. What I'll do now is I'll just run through some of those questions. Linda, I don't know if there's any that have come through.
Yep, sure. I've got a few, Lewis. One of them is: have you ever found an AED that appeared ready but failed when further tested?
That's a good question. I haven't personally. One of the issues with AEDs is sometimes they can look okay, but they haven't been tested. And out in the field, that's something that can come up. AEDs generally must be tested regularly, because they don't look like they haven't been tested for a while. It's the internals that create the issue. It has the battery drained over time. Do the self-check still verify? It's just something that we see quite a lot. And we need to make sure that they're working correctly.
Perfect. So, are there any challenges you've run into when trying to test AEDs, for example, with pads not being reusable or batteries being difficult to source?
Yeah, that's definitely an issue. Batteries are very expensive. They can range from $150 up to $400. They're definitely not cheap, and every discharge is shortening the life of that, and that actually worsens the readiness of an AED in an emergency. So we need to either limit the energy tests that we're performing, unless they're necessary. So sometimes that's either just post repair or during acceptance testing. But also, I think it's important for us to try and push legislation on the manufacturers that we have, that we can have access to AED batteries that are just used for PMs, and we take those batteries just to do the testing and make sure that they're working, and then we use battery tests just to make sure that the batteries inside the unit are working correctly.
Okay, so what's the frequency of testing?
Frequency of testing, that's actually mandated by the OEMs for periodic testing. The truth is, there's not really a mandate for routine testing. Only, and this is for the US only. Most states, they just specify that AEDs are maintained and they're in working order. What does that actually mean? It's quite vague. Who defines whether it's ready? And I think this is where the HTM community can lead. Like, we understand the risks of depleted batteries, any missed self-tests better than anyone. So we need to share that data that we have with the OEMs on why regular inspections matter, and we can use the HTM organizations to push that mandate. But generally, yeah, it just gives you there's not really any laws there for AED testing. We're just relying on the OEMs and what they recommend.
Okay, so are you actually talking about going over and beyond the OEM recommendations?
Yeah, and what we can do to introduce laws that need to be followed for testing AEDs out in the field. I mean, it's working with the OEMs as well to drive that, but also with the HCM organisations in the US to allow us to improve the mandates around testing, not just in hospitals, but out in the public. I mean, we need policies there that ensure AEDs are checked, that documentation is in place, and that they're actually ready. And that might actually involve working with public health groups for clearer AED maintenance laws. There's been some cases in the US in schools where they've gone to use a defib, but it's not working, and it's led to some pretty serious consequences. So there are requirements that we should be working with some health groups as well out in the public.
Okay, perfect. We've got time for about one more question, Lewis. How do you feel about testing AEDs manually as part of your routine maintenance versus relying solely on the device's internal self-tests?
So that's a good question, because I'm personally a metrologist. I've always worked in calibration and testing, and self-tests have never really sat well with me. And the reason for that is that there's no external standard. If you're dealing with a critical medical device, now I'm not criticizing the OEMs, because I'm sure their self-tests are very much verified over a specific period of time. But from a metrology standpoint, you typically need to check a device once a year using an external standard. And the reason for that is you have something called a traceability pyramid, and that means that there's a standard at the top that's measuring, I don't know, for instance, the voltage output of something. If you relying solely on self-tests is higher risk, in my opinion, because over a period of time, how do you ensure that device is still performing its self-test correctly as well? Now that's maybe just a personal opinion, but I think it's something that's echoed within the HCM community. We are relying on a device to test itself, and that doesn't quite sit right, I think.
Perfect. I have got some other questions, Lewis, but as we are nearing our hour, I'm going to send you these attendees questions for you to answer. So thank you to the attendees that have submitted some questions, but I will forward them to Lewis. So thank you so much, Lewis, for a great and a really informative presentation. I'd like to encourage everyone to visit Rigel Medical's website to learn more about the products they provide for the industry. So please visit rigelmedical.com. And as promised, the answer to today's trivia question is purple. So congratulations to our winner, Alan Nicewarner. Just a quick reminder, you can obtain your CE certificate by completing the post-webinar survey, which will be emailed 1 hour after the completion of today's webinar. You must complete the survey to receive your 1 CE credit from the ACI, and you'll be able to download the certificate directly from your computer once the survey is submitted. If you have any questions, you can reach us at webinar@mdpublishing.com. If you've missed any of our past webinars, including any by Rigel Medical, please visit webinarwednesday.live to view our whole webinar archive. We'll be back soon with another webinar, so visit webinarwednesday.live for more details and, of course, complimentary registration. Thank you all once again for your time today, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Linda.
Thank you.
Again.